Okay, we're going to finish up Leuchtenburg today. It's lecture 9 and 10. 10 is very short, so let's start with 9. And okay, we're now back to international affairs, and we're in the beginning stages or just prior to the war. So this section I title "Here Comes the War, 1938." So we were talking previously about the fascist states. One of the ones we talked about was Franco in Spain, the Spanish Civil War. Franco wins the Spanish Civil War, installing a fascist government, defeating the leftists, and did so with the support of Italy and Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler was busy in the expanding German state. Hitler consolidated his power after reoccupying the war. He began to cast his eyes further abroad because any great state needs more territory. So the conclusion of World War I led to the creation of a number of new states that were carved out, most especially from the wreckage of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but also some territory was taken from the German state to create Poland and a few other places. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire resulted in a mixture of new states that were carved up from the defeated territory and were guaranteed by the signatories of the Versailles Treaty. One of those places from the Austro-Hungarian Empire was the nation of Austria. Austria borders Germany, and as the German state was militarizing and agitating that it was going to bring all the greater German people into this greater German state, there was a commiserate fascist movement in Austria that was also ongoing. And so the German state under Adolf Hitler invited Austria to join in a greater Germany. And so German troops arrived on the border with Austria and traveled across, where they were met with flowers, and the Austrian state subsumed itself into this greater German state. This is known as the Anschluss. And it's a expansion, a dissolving of Austria and incorporation into a greater German state. The Allies were not too excited about this, but they didn't do much to stop it. And then after absorbing Austria, Adolf Hitler began to cast his eyes further. And there was a state that was created out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire known as Czechoslovakia. And Czechoslovakia wedded together two ethnic groups, Czechs and Slovaks, to create a state that again was guaranteed by treaty by the Allies, the French and the British. Now, when you create this new state, it's not, as if one half is full of Czechs and one half is full of Slovakians. This Austro-Hungarian Empire was a polyglot empire, meaning there was a mixture of various ethnic groups throughout it, and including a number of ethnic Germans, some of which who had been in what became the territory of Czechoslovakia for a very long time. Many of these Germans were concentrated in a portion of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland. And here they were a very sizable minority. They were not a majority. And so throughout this 1938 year, Adolf Hitler began to agitate that the Czechoslovakians were mistreating these ethnic Germans, especially in the Sudetenland. And so the injustice, as he saw it, cries out for protection. And so he wants to bring these ethnic Germans into the greater state of Germany for their protection. The problem, of course, is the Sudetenland is part of Czechoslovakia, and it's also guaranteed by the French and the British. So the tensions over these incidents of Adolf Hitler claiming that the ethnic Germans are being mistreated was ratcheting up, and it appeared that conflict may break out. This was not something that the French or the British wanted. So in a peacekeeping move, the Prime Minister of Britain set up a meeting with Adolf Hitler to discuss a resolution to this Sudetenland problem. So this Prime Minister, a man by the name of Neville Chamberlain, flew to Munich, where in an office he met with Adolf Hitler to discuss the issues of the Sudetenland. Waiting in the antechamber, not part of the discussion, were representatives of the Czechoslovakian government. So Chamberlain negotiated with Hitler a resolution of the crisis. And as he came out of the room, he informed the Czechoslovakians that this emerging tension had been resolved, he said, by you giving the Sudetenland to Adolf Hitler. He then flew back to London, where in a very famous image, he is pictured descending down the steps of the aircraft, carrying an umbrella, because he's British, and also waving a piece of paper in which he proclaimed, "We will have peace in our time because of this signed agreement between Adolf Hitler." Chamberlain said Hitler only wanted the Sudetenland, asserted that after he received the Sudetenland, he would have no other designs in other places, and that this was a key to peace. Shortly after absorbing the Sudetenland with a sizable minority, but not only ethnic Germans in the state, Adolf Hitler absorbed the rest of Czechoslovakia into this greater state. This is going on in the course of 1938. It's abundantly clear that the Nazi state is seeking expansion at the cost of its neighbors, and Neville Chamberlain's peace in our time did not appear likely to hold. Meanwhile, across the pond here in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is facing a problem. As he looks around Europe and Asia, he sees emerging threats to United States interests. And as he looks around the United States, he sees a nation that is woefully unprepared to engage in conflict overseas, and is also unprepared to protect itself at home. So Adolf Hitler's threats in Europe prompted Franklin Delano Roosevelt to try and invest in some aspects of the United States defense. So while he's trying to raise money to expand the Navy, expand the military, he's being charged by his political critics as trying to divert attention from domestic problems by inventing overseas difficulties. Congress, an isolationist Congress, reflective of an isolationist mood in the country, is hindering Franklin Delano Roosevelt's ability to ramp up U.S. preparedness for potential conflict. He is, however, able to do some stuff because as the chief executive and the executive branch, there are responsibilities that are part of the executive branch that give him some leeway. And one of those things is it's one of those things that are part of a trading relationship. When trading deals are negotiated, they have a sunset clause in which at a certain set period of time, these negotiated relations will come to an end. So you either have to renegotiate to continue them or renegotiate new standards, or whatever those trading deals that are made will come to a conclusion, right? So these sunset clauses usually have a set time that they're put out, 5 years, 10 years, and they're, depends, they're just sort of, here's the deal for the next 5 or 10 years, right? So when the time comes up, it's, nobody projects in the future what's going to happen 5 or 10 years later. So one of these commercial treaties with Japan was coming due. And so this commercial treaty has an end time that's coming, and so they're in negotiations about re-upping it. This gives Franklin Delano Roosevelt some leverage because, as we have seen, the Japanese were busily running amok in China and expanding the interests of the Japanese empire at the expense of their neighbors. And so here's a lever that Franklin Delano Roosevelt can use to restrict or limit potentially what the Japanese empire is doing, especially in China. So they are negotiating this, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt begins to hint at sanctions, that certain things are going to be shut off if the Japanese don't change their international state behavior. He has leverage because two reasons. One, the Japanese, their absorption or looting of Manchuria has brought them all sorts of the raw materials necessary for industrial production. But Manchuria lacked petroleum, right? It didn't have oil and gas deposits, which are key for running a modern industrial military. So the Japanese imported a sizable percentage of their oil and gas from the United States. They imported 100% of their aviation gasoline from the United States. The high octane gas that is used to fuel piston aircraft, it all came from the United States, so they were very vulnerable in that. In addition, the United States shipped an enormous amount of steel to Japan. So the Japanese were really relying upon these petroleum sources and also steel that the United States was shipping. So the idea of threatening to shut them off was a real threat to the Japanese Empire. Excuse me. So this gives Franklin Delano Roosevelt some leverage. Meanwhile, in 1939, late September of 1939, there is a remarkable event that occurs in international diplomacy. During World War I, the French and the British were allied with the Russian Empire. The Germans knocked the Russian Empire out of the war, which prompted or was partly caused by the Communist Revolution. So the Russian Empire under the Tsar became the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, as we shall see in our last book on the Cold War, the Soviet Union was a system that was very antithetical to the interests of the German state. They were very bitter enemies. In Germany, Adolf Hitler's Gestapo and other police forces rounded up communists and radicals and hauled them off to prison. In the Soviet Union, they railed against the fascists who were seeking to expand. So there's a lot of, I suppose, like philosophical differences between the two that are manifest in a lot of tension between the United States and Germany, the Soviet Union and Germany. In addition, they're the two big military powers in the East, so they were very wary of the interests of the other, right? So in the aftermath of World War I, the French and the British remained allied. And although they were not formally allied with the Soviet Union, they anticipated that the colossus of the Soviet Union would serve as a counterweight to German expansion. So even though it wasn't formally part of a treaty obligation, there was an expectation that the Soviet Union would serve to offset Germany. So in late August of 1939, there was a bombshell of an announcement. The Soviet foreign minister, Molotov, held a joint press conference with the German foreign minister, von Ribbentrop, and they announced a non-aggression pact. This non-aggression pact said that the Soviet Union will not go to war against Germany, and Germany would not go to war against the Soviet Union. This was the public aspect of this particular piece of legislation, the Molotov von Ribbentrop Pact. It also had a secret corollary, which was not revealed at this time. What the secret corollary said was that the Nazis informed the Soviets that they were going to invade Poland. And they said, we're going to invade Poland up to this point in Poland, and we're going to take it. What happens on the other side of that line is of no concern to us. So we don't want to accidentally cause a conflict with you, but we're telling you we're going to invade Poland. And so we want you to know that we're not going to invade the Soviet Union after that. And the Soviets said, okay, thanks for the information, right? So in the days leading to this August announcement, late August announcement, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler was agitating that a portion of Poland, in which there was a large percentage, again, not a majority, but a large percentage of ethnic Germans, known as the Danzig Corridor, was a place where Adolf Hitler asserted the Poles were mistreating ethnic Germans. And he said, I want to bring these ethnic Germans under the protective wing of this greater German state by absorbing the Danzig Corridor. That's all I want. I have no interest in anything else except for protecting ethnic Germans. Much in the same way that Czechoslovakia had been, whose borders had been guaranteed by the Versailles Treaty, and the French and the British by obligation, so was Poland. Only this time the British and the French said, okay, you fooled us last time with Czechoslovakia. We're not going to fool you again. We vouch for the borders of Poland. So this amazing, to the eyes of the British and the French, announcement that the Soviets and the Germans had, or the Nazis had reached the non-aggression treaty was extremely alarming. On September 1st, 1939, the Germans concocted a fake story. They took some Polish prisoners out of German prisons, dressed them in Polish military uniforms and shot them, and strew them around railroad crossing. They also led a fake attack on a German radio tower, and then asserted that the Poles had invaded Germany and unleashed the German war machine on poor Poland. September 1st, 1939, World War II breaks out. The German war machine quickly destroys the Polish army, and the Germans rolled through the Polish countryside to a point, and in some cases beyond the point where they had drawn on the map where they would stop. When they reached those places, they turned around and went back. So they wanted to honor their agreement not to attack the Soviets. Little over 2 weeks after Germany invaded Poland from the west, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east and gobbled up the rest of the country. When Germany invaded Poland, France and Britain declared war, maintaining their obligations under treaty. The United States, however, was still neutral. And although they saw the alarming nature of the German exhibition of expansion, many people in the United States thought this was a problem for Europe, not a problem for us here in the United States. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was able to modify the Neutrality Act. In 1939, they modified the Neutrality Act by saying it is now a function of cash and carry. Allies can show up and purchase goods, but they have to bring it home themselves. But now they're allowed to purchase war material. So there is a little bit of movement on that way. Generally, the United States thought this is an issue in Europe, and they adopted what was called a storm cellar idea. We can sit it out, right? If we hunker down in our bunker, close the door, much like a tornado that passes over causing destruction, we can wait out the storm and it won't affect us, mainly because we're on the other side of these two big oceans. They were reflective of a general idea of what people anticipated as well. It was generally thought that this type of warfare would be just like World War I, that it would settle into some sort of trench warfare that would slog on as a war of attrition. And along those lines, the conflict on the Germans' Western Front was almost non-existent. The border with France was heavily barricaded. There was a very expensive and very large set of entrenchments that was known as the Maginot Line. And the Maginot Line was a series of artillery positions, bunkers, trenches, all the things that were designed to prevent a sudden inrush of Germans across the border. And not much is going on at this border. This period, while the Germans are dismembering Poland, and in the aftermath of, in the late fall of 1939 and into the winter of 1939 and 1940, not much is going on the German Western Front, the border between France and Germany. And so this period is known as the Sitzkrieg, right? The sitting war, because, you know, there's not much going on across the Maginot Line. Franklin Delano Roosevelt sees these events with increasing alarm. He understands that Nazi Germany is not going to be satisfied merely with taking Poland, that Adolf Hitler has designs on a greater German state. And this is going to be a threat to the interests of the United States. And he also knows that the United States is woefully unprepared for this coming conflict. So he's faced with a dilemma. How do I wake people up, the American people, to this danger that is coming, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt sees it, without alarming them too much, right? So how do I get them to agree to think about this potential conflict? So I turn this next section called Dragging a Nation to War, which is the way to think about it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt sees these things, but again, he's hindered by the problems of an isolationist Congress and an isolationist public. He also is in the end of his second term, so an election's coming in 1940, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's already held office for 2 years. We'll talk about that in a bit. So the expectations of how this war is supposed to go unfolds quite differently. The sitting war on the Western Front for Germany turns into what's known as the Blitzkrieg. And in the spring of 1940, the Germans unleash this movement of armor and close coordination with aircraft, tactics they first practiced in the Spanish Civil War, practice they unleashed on Poland to great effect, they now unleashed on France. And they rapidly cut through French defenses and began to move very quickly using fast-moving tanks and trucks and half-tracks supported by aircraft, and rapidly split the defenses, the French and the British. Instead of a long drawn-out war of attrition like World War I, this was a rapid war of movement. In a few short weeks, the Germans forced the French to surrender. June 22nd, 1940, the French were forced to surrender. And so for those of you who may think that history doesn't matter, I give you another piece of evidence to suggest it does. When the Germans forced the French to surrender, they took the rail car out of the museum where it had been stored and dragged it to the same patch of woods. And they forced the French military officers to sit at the table and to sign their surrender in the same place that the Germans had signed their surrender in the conclusion of World War I. So they forced the French to sign over their surrender to Nazis in the exact same place that the Germans had been forced to sign a generation before. This was not a war, a Sitzkrieg, it was a Blitzkrieg. And as these events unrolled rapidly in France, the United States military began to recognize, and the American public began to recognize, that they were not safe behind their oceans. And so as they looked at these events unspooling with a great amount of alarm. The United States military ran a war games in upstate New York to test some of these new tactics that they were observing the Germans unleash on their enemies. And it was a disaster. The United States was woefully under-equipped, and they had very little skills at the various sets of movements that were being demonstrated. So they didn't have enough rifles to distribute to soldiers, so they carried broomsticks, and they some of the soldiers carried around a cardboard that said, "I am a truck," or "I am a tank." And so the upshot is this revealed in this new style conflict, the United States was well behind. So this began to move some of the public concept, but they're still deeply isolationist. This is, again, 1940, an election year. And so Franklin Delano Roosevelt is supposed to be nearing the end of his second term. He is ending the near of his second term, is not supposed to run again by convention, not by constitutional amendment. So as the events unspool in Europe, it becomes part of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's plan that he needs to stay as president, right? You can't change horses in midstream, is what he says. So it was, some argued that it was his plan for a much longer period of time than the spring and summer of 1940 to run for a third term. At any rate, at the convention, a mysterious chant began over the loudspeakers saying, "We want Roosevelt to run for a third term." And the entire convention crowd picked it up. And so Franklin Delano Roosevelt, against his will, was drafted to run for a third term at this July convention. As the successes of the Nazis mount in Europe, his opponent, a man by the name of Wendell Willkie, his fortunes decline. Willkie is a moderate Republican. He is a young Republican. He was a electric utility CEO, so he had very little governing experience. And so as these foreign affairs thrust himself more into the debate about how the United States should respond, it becomes, it undercuts support for Wendell Willkie because he's young and inexperienced. And so, for the most part, Wendell Willkie supported much of what Franklin Delano Roosevelt was doing. So the upshot is Wendell Willkie's fortunes decline, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt wins a third term, an unprecedented third term, in November of 1940. Meanwhile, while this is unfolding, Franklin Delano Roosevelt wants to help the British, who are the sole state standing in opposition to Germany after the French surrender in June of 1940. He wants to help the British, but again, he's restricted or constricted by the legislation passed by Congress. There's also these deep isolationist fears. We don't want to get dragged into another World War like we were dragged into World War I. So he's really handcuffed in what he can do. So slowly and carefully, Franklin Delano Roosevelt figures out ways to help the British. And he does this by avoiding having to go through Congress directly. So this practice leads to a group of evasions in order to further support for the British by avoiding Congress. One of these is known as the Destroyer Deal. Destroyer Deal, so again, we need to think about neutrality legislation. Neutrality legislation says you can't sell things on credit to the British, right? Or anybody who's engaged in warfare. That's one of the things Neutrality Act is designed to prevent. They had modified whether or not you could sell stuff, but the United States still could not deliver, right? So they had modified it to cash and carry, which means you can't buy it on credit. You have to pay cash on the barrelhead, and we don't deliver. You have to take this stuff home. This is a problem. The British are under severe threat. They're facing enormous credit difficulties. This war is expensive and they don't have a lot of money. They also were still hurt very badly by the Depression and the expenditures of World War I. So the British don't have a lot of money to purchase these things, and they don't have a lot of ships to come all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to pick it up. So they're under difficulties, and they need more equipment. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes up with a plan. It's known as the destroyer deal. And so Franklin Delano Roosevelt says, I'm going to barter, swap, exchange these old, worn out destroyers to the British, and in exchange, I will get some long-term leases to British territory in the Caribbean. This will actually make the United States safer by these long-term bases, and we're giving them something that really wasn't particularly useful. These are old and surplus destroyers. Now, this is problematic because just a few months earlier, admirals from the United States Navy had gone before Congress and said, we need to refurbish these ships. They're vital to U.S. defense. But disregarding that previous testimony, Franklin Delano Roosevelt labeled them as old and decrepit. And because this is a swap, it's not a treaty obligation, it doesn't have to go before the United States Congress. And he sells it to the American people by saying this will make us safer. It's really about getting equipment into the hands of the British. The British need every ship they can get a hold of. Destroyers are good ships for them to have. The United States wants to give it to them, but the British can't pay for it, so we come up with a system to evade. And so the destroyer deal goes through. Franklin Delano Roosevelt looks around, excuse me, at the United States military, and he sees it as quite small. In fact, on the eve of World War II, the United States military was the 19th largest military in the world. Greece had a bigger military than the United States did. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt says, we need to get a bigger army. So he asks Congress for a draft. He wants to draft 1 million men, as he says, and these 1 million men will be trained and equipped and ready to serve in the protection of the United States. But Congress is suspicious because they fear that if they give Franklin Delano Roosevelt a 1 million man army, he's going to take them over to Europe and we're going to be involved in conflict. So they say, okay, you can have your 1 million man army draft, but we are limiting it only to the Western Hemisphere. You cannot take these people out of the Western Hemisphere. That's the only place they're authorized. Franklin Delano Roosevelt says, well, half a loaf is better than no loaf. So he agrees to that formulation and he gets his 1 million man draft. They're drafted for 1 year service. This is the summer of 1940. The British have no money. You can't give them things on credit, right? They can't go in debt to borrow, to purchase these things. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes up with a program he calls Lend-Lease, right? In which he says, we're going to lend our neighbors the equipment they need. And he sells it to the American public in a very homey speech in which he says, if your neighbor's house was on fire, you wouldn't sell him your garden hose. You would lend him your garden hose to help put out the fire. And once the fire's out, as a good neighbor, your friend will return your garden hose. And if your garden hose is damaged, why, your friend will purchase you a new garden hose in lieu of the one that has been damaged. He uses this homey metaphor to explain just what he wants to do. He wants to give the British military equipment, bullets, howitzers, boats, planes, things like that, lending them to them. And then supposedly they're going to give them back to us at the end of the war. Well, after you fire a bullet, you can't very well return it. It's sort of cockamamie, but it's a way to avoid the restrictions put in place by Congress, right? So these are all things that Franklin Delano Roosevelt is having to go through to get around it. And so again, we're still in the summer of 1940. Now we are approaching 1941, right? So 1941, Germany has conquered France and much of the territory of Europe. They are bombing Britain in the Battle of Britain. The British troops were driven out with the defeat of the French, leaving most of their equipment behind when they left at Dunkirk. So the British are hanging on by their fingernails, and the United States wants to help them. But again, that million-man army can't leave the Western Hemisphere, and there's a lot of pressure for the United States not to get involved. So they have to come up with another system, right? So what they do, what Franklin Delano Roosevelt does in April, is he extends U.S. convoying of supplies to the British to Greenland, and he stations some of these troops in Greenland. And so now the United States is going to deliver goods to Greenland, where the British Navy will pick them up and take them on to the British home isles, right? He does this by saying that Greenland is part of the Western Hemisphere. And so here I have a little map. We'll take a look at where Greenland is. Okay, so here are the British Isles. Here's the United States, and here is Greenland. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt is authorizing the United States Navy to convoy supplies to Greenland, where then the British will pick them up and take them over. And he says Greenland, in his definition, is part of the British, or is part of the Western Hemisphere, right? I hope you can see that. It's always hard for me to tell. Okay, so let's go, sorry. Let's get this off my screen. And hopefully you are going to see the rest of it here. Okay, so that's in April of 1941. June 22nd, 1941, the Germans invade the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa is the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union, violating the terms of the piece of paper known as the Molotov-von Ribbentrop Pact. I should say that Stalin was the head of the Soviet Union, was not fooled by this piece of paper. He had no illusions that the conflict between the Soviets and the Nazis would come someday. In fact, when he signed this agreement, he said to his surviving generals, because he had purged so many, get ready, we will be at war with Nazi Germany by 1943. He was off by a couple of years. Further, he had ignored what the British were trying to tell Stalin diplomatically through the diplomatic cables, that there was a lot of indications that Germany was preparing for an attack on the Soviet Union in 1941. Stalin thought this was propaganda and disinformation, and refused to believe the Nazis would be invading so soon, but they did. And so in the third week of June, the Nazis unleashed their war machine on the Soviet Union to great effect. And they were destroying Soviet military forces and driving to Moscow. The United States is observing this. And on June 30th, Franklin Delano Roosevelt extended the Lend-Lease program to the Soviet Union in the same fashion that he was extending it to the British. And he invited the Soviet Union to borrow these war materials from the United States. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is a realist. He doesn't have any great love for the Soviet Union. He's well aware of the murderous reputation that Joseph Stalin has. He also understands the antipathy between communism and capitalism. And so he's under no illusions about who Joseph Stalin is, but he, as a realist, says, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so he extends support to the Soviets to help them in this conflict against Nazi Germany, because he quite properly identified Nazi Germany as a bigger threat to the interests of the United States. In July of 1941, that one-year draft equipment requirement is coming to an end. And so Franklin Delano Roosevelt goes to the Congress and says, wait a minute. we need these men more than ever, right? I know that they were only drafted for 1 year, but we've spent all this effort to train and equip them. We can't let them loose. And so he says, I want to keep them for another year. Congress says, no. And he says, but these are important for the safety of the United States. And they say, no, we can't have him for another year. That was the agreement. It was a 1-year agreement. So he says, well, how about a half a year? And Congress says, okay, we'll put it to a vote. In late July 1941, the authorization to keep this 1 million-man army that had been drafted and trained for another extended period of time, 6 months, passed the House of Representatives by 1 vote. This is almost August 1941, and still the Congress is resistant to this idea of the United States preparing for war, because they say, if we prepare for war, then we will be dragged into war, right? So Franklin Delano Roosevelt does get this re-upped to 18 months, right? So he gets to keep them for another 6 months. I suppose in theory, they would be facing this battle again in 6 months, but events overtook it. August 9th, Franklin Delano Roosevelt meets in the North Atlantic at sea with Winston Churchill. And what they negotiate in what's known as the Atlantic Charter is a document that gives shape to their vision of what the world's going to look like. The United States has the British over a barrel. They need all the help they can get. So Winston Churchill agrees with whatever Franklin Delano Roosevelt is suggesting. And what he's suggesting is, in effect, the recreation of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. As we saw in the film, with the conclusion of World War I, it was British desire to protect and even expand their empire that prompted them to force much more onerous terms on the defeated Germans, even though Woodrow Wilson thought that was a bad idea. Here, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is forcing the British to adhere to these ideas by saying, you want U.S. support, you're going to have to agree to this. And so Winston Churchill agrees. So they issue the Atlantic Charter on August 9th, 1941. September 1st, the British are still incredibly stretched, trying to get these convoys of supply. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt engages in another bit of map-making work, and he does the following. Uh-oh, I lost my map. Bummer. Okay, so I'll post the map on Blackboard. But he extends the Western Hemisphere to Iceland. Iceland is, by almost every definition, not part of the Western Hemisphere, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt recognizes how desperate the British are, so he extends this U.S. Delivery of goods to Iceland. This is not a benign operation. The North Atlantic, or the Atlantic in general, is the prowling ground of German submarines who are seeking to cut the lifeline of support to the British Isles. So they're sinking ships. Extending U.S. convoys, or U.S. Navy protection of convoys of ship going to the UK, is putting the United States in the crosshairs of these German U-boats. It is not should not come as any surprise that there's an incident with U.S. Navy ships traveling around in the North Atlantic. And this incident is known as the Greer incident. The USS Greer is a destroyer that is torpedoed by a German U-boat, killing U.S. sailors. And this is an example of presidential lying, because Franklin Delano Roosevelt went before the American public and said, the USS Greer was peacefully traveling around the North Atlantic and was maliciously assaulted without warning by a German U-boat, killing U.S. sailors and violating international naval law. This story comes, by the way, from Robert Dallek, who wrote a book on Franklin Delano Roosevelt's foreign policy. This is untrue. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew it to be untrue. And he was purposely lying to the American public. And the reason why he was lying to the American public was that he was seeking to persuade the American public that we need to get in this war against Germany. But the American public were deeply resistant on this idea of going to war. So he's using this as a vehicle to try and get US support for entering the war. We know what happened with the Greer. So did Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Greer was serving as a convoy support for delivery of war materials to the British. It was sailing in the North Atlantic. A Canadian airplane had spotted the conning tower of a German U-boat and had sounded the alarm. The Greer had chased this German U-boat with the intent of sinking it. Over 24 hours, the Greer dropped depth charges 3 separate times trying to sink this U-boat. But the U-boat captain must have been very good because he avoided these efforts to sink his sub, and he maneuvered his ship into position where he was able to fire a torpedo and hit the Greer. So not a case of a U.S. warship happily sailing around the North Atlantic, but actually a case of the United States Navy trying to sink a German submarine, which would be an act of war. At any rate, the people were outraged, but it did not lead to the declaration of war. But it's part of the expected outcome of extending U.S. presence into a raging conflict, the raging conflict of World War II. There's also another event that occurs that is an accidental event. There was a lot of rhetoric in 1941 about putting pressure on the Japanese. And in September of 1941, it had become clear that the Japanese believed that the United States had embargoed oil against them. What had led to this Japanese belief is the following. Japanese tankers had shown up in June to fill up their vessels with petroleum purchased from the United States. And they were informed that they could not do so because oil products were embargoed against Japan. So the ships had to turn around and sail back empty. This set in motion and firmly set into place Japanese concerns. The Japanese knew they were vulnerable on this issue of supply of petroleum, and they knew that if this supply was cut off, that they would only have several months of fuel stored up in order to run their war machine. So they knew this as an existential threat to their interests as the Japanese Empire. And so they began to, they set in motion a plan to fix this problem as they saw it. This was an accidental embargo. The United States State Department, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had not ordered this. Somewhere along the line, this threat had gotten translated into an actual act of action. And so when the United States State Department found out that the Japanese were under the impression that the oil embargo had been in place as opposed to threatened, well, they were kind of stuck. You can't very well say, oh, wait, it was a mistake. Now you can buy all the oil you want, because they knew that the Japanese would see this as a sign of weakness and that they're capitulating to the threats of the Japanese. So the United States was kind of inadvertently involved in this embargo. The Japanese had made a decision that they were going to pursue the policy they had pursued with Manchuria. They were going to seize the territory and stuff they needed, and then hunker down and wait out what the result would be, and then negotiate some sort of settlement from that. So what are the Japanese planning on doing? They're going to get their own oil and gas, and the place they're going to get it is from the Dutch East Indies. But in order to steal this territory that produced oil and gas from the Dutch, who were under the occupation of the Nazis at this time, in order to do that, they were going to have to immobilize the British, because the British still had a significant military presence in the Eastern Pacific. And a bigger threat they saw was that extending this sort of Japanese empire growth was going to be opposed by the United States, who were also a very significant presence in the Eastern Pacific. So the Japanese decided in order to steal this territory they wanted with the oil and gas, they're going to have to mobilize both the British and the United States. And the best way they thought to do that would be to destroy the Pacific Fleet at anchor. And so as part of this effort to ensure a steady supply of the raw materials for a greater Japanese empire, they unleashed a surprise attack on the Navy at anchor at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. This was the calculation by the Japanese that once they stole the stuff they needed and bloodied the Americans a bit when they tried to undo this stealing, that the Americans would be forced to reach some sort of accommodation in which the Japanese would get what they wanted and would have to, pay some sort of penalty, but the penalty would be so minor. They figured things would go the same way as when they had stolen parts of China in the form of Manchuria. With the assault by the Japanese, the United States was launched into war. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a little bit of concern, because as much as he was angered by the events in the Pacific and was concerned about the expansion of the Japanese empire, he recognized quite accurately that a bigger threat to the United States interests and the world interests was Nazi Germany. So he didn't want to go just to war against the Japanese, who had aligned themselves with the Nazis, now into what was known as the Axis powers. But he wanted to get involved and support the conflict against Nazi Germany. Well, his dilemma is resolved because on December 11th, for reasons that are still not abundantly clear, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States. And so now the United States was thrust into war. So I should tell you at this point, we have two marvelous classes taught by John Dreifert on the history of World War II. And so I encourage you to take those courses. I'm going to talk about sort of a setup for the two films briefly, and then we'll finish our Leuchtenburg discussion with a little section about what the impact is of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency and what Leuchtenburg argues in the book. So the United States is launched into the war, and for the United States, it's a two-front war because they're supporting and fighting in Europe, and they're also doing the lion's share of the fighting in the Pacific. In the Pacific against the Japanese, in Europe against the Italians and the Germans, but largely against the Germans, right? The United States identified Germany as a greater threat, and that was the main theater for the United States. But they didn't provide the lion's share of the forces. The lion's share of the fighting and forces that were conducted in Europe to defeat the Nazis came by way of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, invaded by the Germans at great, enormous costs of blood and treasure, stopped the German onslaught and slowly, painfully, at great cost, shoved them back to Germany. And we'll see some, I'll show you some maps about Soviet occupation when we start doing the book on the Cold War. So this effort is one that is largely fought by the Soviets and supported by the British and United States. The United States produced an enormous quantity of war material that was used by all the Allies in defeating the Germans. The United States and the British fought in North Africa. They invaded Italy. Then they assaulted across the English Channel, landing in France, and drove from France, through France to Germany at great cost of blood and treasure. It's dwarfed by the expenditures of the Soviets on the Eastern Front. But combined, they all fought to destroy Nazi Germany. In the Pacific, this is almost completely a U.S. war. The U.S., at great cost of blood and treasure, seeks to shove back this expansive Japanese empire. And it comes with a tactic that they developed known as island hopping. Initially, it was determined that every island the Japanese had captured, they would have to evict the Japanese. This was an enormously difficult prospect. So they developed a tactic known as island hopping, where they would identify an island that they were going to assault. They would capture that island, and then they would turn it into a series of runways where they would then use that to launch long-distance bombing campaigns against other Japanese territories. And so this island hopping campaign, the idea was to hop their way back to the Japanese home islands for an eventual invasion. The two films you're going to see are in the latter stages of the war. The United States enters the war in 1941, and a great effort successfully fought their way across the Pacific. Meanwhile, they were also fighting in Europe. So as they're fighting their way back, they're capturing islands that they are then using as a launching point to capture new islands. Where the film picks up Victory in the Pacific, it picks up with the Invasion of Okinawa. This is a series of Japanese-held islands that they're going to capture, that are going to serve as a launching point for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. It comes at the end of a long and bloody process to drive across the Pacific, capturing these islands at great cost, right? So that's where we're going to pick up. So the film is going to show you two views of the United States' decision to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The impact, according to Leuchtenburg, of what Franklin Delano Roosevelt does. He calls the Roosevelt Reconstruction, he calls it, it's really a revolution, right? This is a remaking of the federal government and the executive. It sets in path a direction that continues unto the present day. From the founding of the nation, as we saw when we were discussing the Civil War, there's been this tug between local and federal power. The Roosevelt Revolution firmly entrenches the executive branch as the locus of power in the United States government, trumping state and local power completely, and also placing the executive in a position compared to the legislature where it has much more of the initiative than it had previously. So the Roosevelt Revolution creates an enormously powerful executive branch and chief executive president. This is a federalist government in which the federal government is the locus of the greatest amount of power and authority and dictates to state and local authorities the directions that the nation will respond. It cements in the United States this idea that welfare is a right, that providing for the care and protection of your citizens is a function of government. It's a function the government not only should do in times of emergency, but is a function of the way the government should operate. This is a reordering of the way US society has traditionally viewed these things. For example, it was anticipated that you would be responsible for your own retirement. It was not somebody else's responsibility, and certainly not the government's responsibility to care for you in your aged years. While the creation of Social Security says there needs to be some sort of system to provide a floor to protect our population as they age. That for reasons that are not your fault, you could end up in desperate circumstances, whether it's because of some sort of economic disaster, like the Great Depression, or some sort of health event that robs you of any and all of your savings, right? Any one of these things prior to the New Deal would mean you're on your own. You'd hope for private charity, maybe you would have family members who would care for you, but at any rate, it was nobody's official responsibility to care for you, right? Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the New Deal changes that. It says the government has a responsibility for the safety and well-being of its citizens beyond just military and policing, right? So these are things that are created as part of the New Deal and part of Leuchtenburg's interpretation. And so as you go on to see the two films, think about how these things are related to what Leuchtenburg argues and how these things are related to events in World War II. All right, we'll pick up next time. We'll start with the John Lewis Gaddis book on the Cold War, and we'll also do a lecture on a chapter on civil rights. All right, see you next time.